It's time to get started with Bible class this morning.
That was the best lesson you have had yet, although all your lessons are good.
Well, I
Great.
appreciate it.
But this is excellent.
Thank you. I appreciate
Okay?
it. Thank you.
It really is.
We're running late here.
As soon as everybody gets in, we'll get started. We're in Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. We got a short class today. I don't know whose fault that is. But, all right. We did the rest of chapter 35 and chapter 36 last week. Chapter 35 just dealt with some details of Jacob finally going back home, finally doing what God had told him to do. He came back to his father's house to get to see him, and we talked about he's going to get to spend 10, maybe 12 years with his father when he comes home. Chapter 36 was simply dealing with the family of Esau. And we talked about the purpose in that chapter was so that the Israelite people would know who the descendants of Esau was, and God had promised them some things. And so it was good that the children of Israel knew who they were. Chapter 37 begins the story of Joseph, if you will. Pretty much the rest of the book of Genesis is going to be the story of Joseph going into Egypt and preserving life for the Hebrew people. So, it opens up, chapter 37, it says, "Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." Opens up very generic because it's not in chronological order. We said that Joseph's father Isaac actually saw Joseph or be able to be sold into slavery, and he could comfort his son Jacob during all of that if you go with the actual time period. So chapter 35 ends with Isaac dying, but actually Isaac doesn't die until later after chapter 37. But it's just dealing with this timeline, the things that happened when Jacob finally got back home to where his father was. Verse 2 says, "This is the history of Jacob." So we said in chapter 37, and rightly so, the rest of the book of Genesis primarily deals with Joseph. But God, through inspiration, says this is the history of Jacob. Because you see, throughout the rest of our Bible, we're going to talk about the 12 tribes, right? And Joseph just played a major part in the history of Jacob. His part was to preserve the people through the providence of God, and I've taught lessons on that here before, but this is the history of Jacob. God is forming Israel's future. God had made some promises, God had made some prophecies, some foretelling of future events, and this is the beginning of all of that unfolding. It says, Joseph being 17 years old. Joseph is a teenager, what we would be maybe a senior in high school now, right? So you just look at the amount of pressure that's going to be thrown on this young man. 17's young, isn't it? 17's young. But Joseph was a man, a good man. In fact, Joseph is one of the few Bible characters, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's no recorded sin. Now, don't misunderstand me. I know Joseph sinned a lot, just like everybody else, but the Bible doesn't tell us about it. Usually it tells us a lot of the bad things that people did. Maybe Joseph had some pride, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but he's a young man, he doesn't understand a lot of things. But the Bible doesn't record a lot of bad things that Joseph did. It chooses only to record the good. Now, it's chosen to record the bad things Abraham did, the bad things Isaac, most certainly the bad things Jacob, recorded the bad things David did, these prominent Bible characters, but doesn't record that on Joseph. Again, not meaning that he was perfect, but he was a good man. It said, Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah and his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now, I want to look at this maybe I'm looking at it in a different way than I've ever looked at it before. Not anything, drastic. But I believe Joseph had a position of authority among his brothers. I didn't believe that before until preparing for this class, but I believe Joseph, by his father, had been put into that position of authority. I believe Jacob had put Joseph in charge of a lot of his brothers, and I'm going to show you why I believe that. That word feeding, and again, you guys know I'm not one that goes to the Hebrew or the Greek much. That word feeding can mean to rule. Joseph could be saying that he was the shepherd. He was the shepherd. He was the one in charge of all of this. He was feeding the flock of his brothers, and he was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Now, Jacob had 4 wives, right? Leah and Rachel were real wives, I guess you could say. The real housewives of Jacob, right? The TV shows. I've never watched them, but I've seen them on advertisement. Those were the real wives. Now Bilhah and Zilpah, what were they? They were called wives, but really what were they? They're just concubines. They're really just handmaids. So, in the whole scheme of things, now think about it in the time period, those 2 women's sons would be what? They'd be less than, right? Rachel's sons, she's the favorite. Her sons are going to be up here. Leah's sons are going to be slightly less than that. Sons of handmaids is going to be on down here at the bottom. They were from women that weren't even really a wife, and therefore as positions of authority, as it is during this time period, Joseph was out with these 2, with these sons, with these 4 sons. And the Bible says that he brought a bad report back to his father. Why would he bring a bad report back to his father? You say, well, he's 17 years old and he's a tattletale. Does that happen? Oh, yeah, all the time, right? You've got a lot of teenage tattletales. You got some adult tattletales. I know some old people that tattletale. I don't think that's what this is. I think, and I'm going to attempt to prove this as we go along, I believe Joseph has been put in charge by his father. He's been put in charge of these young men, and therefore it is his job to report back to the father how things are going. In fact, we're going to see in a minute that Jacob is going to send Joseph some 70 or 80 miles to check on his brothers, right? And what does Jacob say? You go check on your brothers, and what do? You bring a report back to me. Isn't that the exact same thing he just did here? He's feeding the flock, and he is reporting back to his father, and maybe the report, it's a bad report, so more than likely, maybe these brothers, they're not doing a good job. Maybe they're not feeding the flock like they should. Maybe they're being harsh to the flock. It really doesn't make any difference at this point. But whatever it is they're doing, it's not right. And Jacob needs to know about it because his livelihood, his possessions could suffer because of that. So, verse 3, it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. Favoritism. Has this been a problem throughout our study of Genesis? It's been a prominent problem, right? There's been favoritism the whole time. I mean, even with Abraham. Abraham liked who? He liked Ishmael, didn't he? And he wanted God to fulfill the promise through Ishmael. He didn't want to send Ishmael away, if you'll remember that. Okay, we get into that. You've got Isaac and Rebekah, and they have 2 children, Jacob and Esau. Was there favoritism? Oh, yes, there's favoritism. I mean, Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob, and they both did everything they could do to benefit their favorite. Well, okay, Jacob leaves, and he goes and he has 2 wives. Is there favoritism? Yes. This is the same thing that happens over and over and over again, and nobody's learned from it. You would think Jacob would have learned better, right? You think he'd learned better. I mean, favoritism started all of these problems that's been in Jacob's life. But he's doing the exact same thing. He didn't learn anything. In fact, Joseph was the favorite because he was born of his old age. And he was born of the wife that he loved dearly. He loved Rachel. That's the only one that he wanted to start with. Leah was just a trick, a deceitfulness that was brought upon him. So favoritism is a problem here. Because of that favoritism, he made him a tunic of many colors. Dolly Parton sang a song, right? Coat of many colors. You've heard that. What was the coat? I believe the coat was more of a symbol of authority. What I believe it was. It could mean a coat with sleeves. Most people, when they wore the tunics, they didn't have sleeves. It was a hole for your neck and you put it on. But this coat had sleeves. On the job site sometimes, if you're on a job site and people are wearing hard hats, does the boss have a different color hard hat? Why? Because that is a symbol of authority. Does, in the military, maybe you've got some stripes on your jacket that other people don't have? What does that mean? That's some authority, right? This coat was something that would symbolize that authority, I believe. And again, I'm going to prove that as we go along. When Joseph is going to see his brothers much later in this chapter, and they see him a great way off, how do you think they saw him a great way off? Because his coat, right? And we're going to see that these brothers hated that authority that he had. In fact, I want you, if you will, go to 1 Chronicles chapter 5, and I'm going to do this on my phone for quickness. And we're going to read the first 3 verses, and I'm going to use this to try to prove my point a little bit more. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. During this time period, who had the birthright? The firstborn, right? The firstborn, and they were going to be in charge. They were getting more of the inheritance and all these things. And we've talked about the birthright a lot. Esau sold his birthright, and he traded, got rid of his blessing, all of those things. But don't you notice something that Genesis doesn't tell us until much, much later, but 1 Chronicles 5 does. It says, now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. Reuben was the firstborn, right? Jacob married Leah. Leah had Reuben. He's the firstborn. He says, he was indeed the firstborn. But because he defiled his father's bed, how did he defile his father's bed? He went into one of those 2 concubines, right? We talked about that. The Bible just mentioned it in passing. It really didn't go into much detail, but it just mentioned it. But because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. Because Reuben defiled his father's bed, who got the birthright? Joseph. And Joseph in turn passed that on to Ephraim and Manasseh, right? He's going to have those later on. So, does it stand to reason that Jacob had put him in a position of authority? Reuben had lost the birthright, and that happened before this. And so therefore, Jacob, man, I'm out of time already, put him in this position of authority. And this coat would be something that would, I believe, symbolize that position. It says, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. What kind of family life do you think that would be? What kind of family life would it be if you've got all of these siblings and they absolutely despise one another to the point that they can't say anything good to one another? You want to live in that house? Does that happen all the time? Happens all the time, doesn't it? Happens all the time. But let's go back to the lesson this morning. There was no unity among these brothers. Why? What's the root of the problem? Jealousy. Where does jealousy come from? Pride. Jealousy comes from pride. I don't care how you slice it. You are jealous of somebody else because you want to be where they are, because you are self-seeking, thinking more of yourself than you should, and all of those things. So there's no unity in this family. It's just a huge, colossal mess. Verse 5, to make things worse. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. So we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. Now, I said the Bible doesn't record Joseph's sin. Could this be one where he had pride? I don't know. Maybe he's just a young man. He doesn't understand what this dream is, but he sure is eager to tell it. Sure is eager to tell it. And his brother said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. They already hated him because he had what? I told you I'm studying this different, because he had some authority. If your younger brother has authority over you, that's not going to go over well, is it? No, I mean, even in today, you don't want your younger sibling, because if you're the older, you want to be what? You're in charge, right? You're the oldest one. You know more. You're smarter. You're bigger. You're strong, whatever it might be. And these guys didn't like that. And now he's having dreams. And in these dreams, he has authority over them. And what do they say? Are you going to have dominion over us? Are you going to reign over us? Are we going to bow down? I mean, all of these things. Jesus was rejected because of his authority. You ever thought about that? Now we're going to look at this as we go through. Joseph and Jesus had a lot of similarities. But Jesus was rejected because of his authority. What did the Pharisees? They made one statement over and over again. Jesus was teaching these things, saying these things, and what did they say? By what authority do you do this? By what authority? Who gave you this authority? Who are you to say all these things? And Jesus would tell them, my authority comes from my Father which is in heaven. Joseph's brothers hated him for the exact same reason. They didn't like the idea that Joseph was above them, were better than them or whatever. Verse 9, it says, then he dreamed still another dream, and he told it to his brothers. And he said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. We're studying Revelation on Wednesdays. What does the number 2 stand for? Confirmation, right? If there's 2 witnesses, it's confirmation. God revealed the same dream. You say it's not the same dream yet, it is. In a different way, but it's the same dream. You know, the sheaves bowed down to his sheaves, the sun and moon bowed down to him. I mean, in truthfulness, what's the dream about? Joseph, you're going to have authority, and your brothers are going to bow down to you. I want to show you something interesting. Turn over to Revelation chapter 12. And I know our time is about up. But we said the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation ties together a lot, and they do. You've got the beginning of all things, you've got the end of all things. So this last dream that he had, there is a sun, a moon, and the 11 stars are bound down to him. Chapter 12 of the book of Revelation opens, and it says, now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars, gave birth to a child, right? Who's the child? I know I'm way ahead in the book of Revelation. The child is Jesus. Who gave birth to Jesus? Sun and moon and the 12 stars. What's Joseph dreaming about? Sun and moon and 11 stars, but he's the 12th. Who gave birth to Jesus? God's covenant people. And God is unfolding that history in the book of Genesis right now that's going to carry us through the rest of our Bibles. I appreciate your attention.